My own son shoved me off a cliff, and as the air rushed past us, my wife's whisper cut through the terror, "Pretend we're dead." That single moment wasn't just about survival, it was the fracture of trust, the shattering of blood ties, and the beginning of a fight we never thought we'd have against the child we raised. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Setting the Stage. I've always thought of myself as a simple man, shaped by the forests of Oregon and the quiet rhythm of small-town life. At 62, my days rarely strayed from routine. I woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of dark coffee, and stepped out onto the back porch to watch the mist roll off the river that curled behind our house. The smell of pine, the faint chatter of birds, and the hum of distant logging trucks, those were the sounds of my retirement. My wife, Helen, would join me soon after, carrying her gardening gloves and reminding me that the roses wouldn't prune themselves. Together, we built a quiet, steady life. To anyone watching from the outside, it must have looked picture perfect. Our little town of Riverton wasn't remarkable by any measure, but it was home. Nestled against the Willamette River, it carried the kind of stubborn charm that kept folks rooted for decades. We had the Saturday farmers market where you could buy fresh honey and smoked salmon, the modest church at the end of Main Street, and a town council that spent more time arguing about potholes than politics. After retiring from 30 years managing a lumber mill, I found myself grateful for the stillness Riverton offered. Life slowed to fishing trips, backyard barbecues, and card games at the VFW hall. Family had always been the center of our lives. Helen and I had 2 sons. Andrew, our firstborn, and Jason, our youngest, by 5 years. Andrew had been the kind of boy any father would be proud of. Sharp, compassionate, always dreaming of bigger horizons, but we lost him in what the sheriff called an accident when he was just 20. That loss carved a hollow in my chest that never really healed. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake at night and swear I can hear his laugh drifting down the hallway. Helen and I held each other together through that grief, but it marked us forever. Jason, on the other hand, grew into a quieter man. He wasn't Andrew, though I never let myself say that out loud. He had a brooding way about him, but I still loved him fiercely. He married a woman named Lauren, and they gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren who filled our house with life again. Helen doted on them endlessly, teaching them how to bake pies and plant tulip bulbs in the front yard. Jason brought the kids by most Sundays, and though his smile didn't always reach his eyes, I told myself it was just the weight of bills and work. Times were hard for young families. I wanted to believe that. Most evenings ended the same. Helen and I sitting on the porch, sipping sweet tea, and talking about what the years ahead might bring. We dreamed of taking a road trip along the Pacific Coast Highway, of showing the grandchildren Yosemite, of downsizing to a smaller cabin once we couldn't manage the stairs anymore. After 40 years together, Helen was still my partner in every sense. She could read my moods without a word, and I leaned on her calm steadiness more than I ever admitted. And yet, beneath all of this ordinary comfort, there were shadows. I had begun to notice little cracks in Jason's demeanor, a strange sharpness in his tone when money came up, a flicker of irritation when Helen and I spoke about our will or the property we owned. Once at a barbecue, I caught him staring at the old oak dining table I had carved years ago, not with nostalgia, but with calculation. I brushed it aside. Fathers are supposed to believe the best about their sons, aren't they? My closest friend, Victor Kane, sometimes hinted at what I refused to see. Victor was a retired Marine, the kind of man who trusted his instincts. Over coffee one morning, he muttered, "Mike, you ever get the feeling your boy's carrying a chip on his shoulder too big for his own good?" I laughed it off, told him Jason was just stressed, but Victor's eyes stayed steady on mine, and for a moment I felt something twist in my gut. Still, I kept convincing myself that all families had tension. After all, Jason still came around, still helped me fix the shed roof when it sagged, still hugged his mother on her birthday. How could I imagine that the son we'd raised, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man whose hand I shook on his wedding day, would one day see us as obstacles rather than parents? If I had known what was coming, I might have paid more attention to those shadows. I might have asked harder questions, looked deeper into the unease Helen sometimes hinted at when Jason's visits stretched too long. But I didn't. I kept sipping my coffee, fixing fence posts, and holding on to the belief that family meant safety. What I didn't realize was that the life Helen and I had built so carefully, the home, the savings, the dreams for the future, was beginning to look less like a legacy to our son and more like a prize he couldn't wait to claim. And before long, that prize would push him to do something so unthinkable, so monstrous, it would shatter every notion I had of love and loyalty. Looking back now, I see the warning signs everywhere. But at the time, I only knew the comfort of habit, the solace of routine, and the quiet trust that blood was thicker than water. I had no idea that trust would be the very thing to betray me. Because just 3 days ago, on a cliff overlooking the river valley, Jason's hands pressed against my back, shoving me toward the abyss. And as my body plummeted toward the rocks below, the only sound I carried with me was Helen's whisper in my ear, "Pretend we're dead." The evening had been quiet, the kind of Sunday night that should have ended with warm laughter and the smell of Helen's apple pie still lingering in the air. Our grandchildren had scattered toys across the living room, and Helen had fussed gently as she picked up after them, humming one of her old hymns. I sat back in my chair with a mug of coffee, letting the sound of their tiny voices wash over me. It should have been a moment of peace, but there was something off in the air, something heavy that I couldn't quite name. Across the table, Jason leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room like he wasn't really present. When the kids tugged at his sleeve, asking him to play, he gave them a quick smile, but didn't move. His gaze kept drifting toward the oak sideboard where Helen and I kept a stack of folders, deeds, insurance papers, and the sort of documents families carry for decades. His interest wasn't casual. It was the kind of look a man gives when he's measuring value. He cleared his throat and asked, almost too casually, "Dad, have you and Mom ever thought about what you'll do with the house? You know, when you two get older?" The words came out smooth, but they left an aftertaste. Helen gave a polite laugh, shaking her head, brushing flour from her apron. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," she said, her tone light but firm. Jason shrugged, eyes narrowing just a little. It wasn't the first time he had brought it up. Lately, his visits had carried more questions than conversation. He spoke less about his construction work, more about retirement accounts, property taxes, and savings. The way he asked made me feel less like his father and more like a ledger he was balancing in his head. Helen tried to smooth things over as she always did. She offered him more pie, teased him about needing to relax, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. When Jason left that night, the grandchildren clinging to his hands, she lingered at the window longer than usual. "He's been different lately," she murmured, almost to herself. I didn't know how to answer, so I kissed her temple and told her not to worry. But deep down, her words clung to me. Over the next few weeks, the pattern grew clearer. Jason stopped bringing Lauren to dinner. Sometimes he came alone, staying only long enough to hover near the kitchen counter and pepper me with questions about the land by the river or my pension plan from the mill. One afternoon, after he left his coat behind, I picked it up to hang in the closet and felt papers crinkle in the pocket. I froze, then pulled them out. Mortgage statements, late notices, debt stacked higher than I wanted to imagine. I tucked them back before Helen could see, my stomach heavy with dread. I found myself remembering Andrew. He would have been 40 now, maybe living in Portland, maybe still sketching designs for the cabin he once dreamed of building. His death, called an accident, had been a wound that reshaped our entire lives, and I had sworn then to pay closer attention, to never again miss the signs of trouble brewing beneath the surface. Yet here I was, doing the same thing, ignoring the cold draft creeping into my home. Helen wasn't blind either. She noticed Jason's clipped tone, the way he avoided eye contact when she asked about Lauren or the children. One night, as we washed dishes, she said softly, "He doesn't ask about us anymore. Not about my arthritis, not about your back, only about paperwork." She set the dish towel down and looked at me with eyes I'd known for 40 years. Something's wrong. I wrapped my arm around her, told her he was just stressed, but my own words sounded hollow. The unease grew sharper during a family walk one Saturday. We had taken the kids to the ridge above the river, a place where Andrew used to love sitting with his sketchbook. The view stretched for miles, pines, silver water, the mountains in the distance. Jason stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, eyes on the drop. For a fleeting second, he turned to look at me. There was something in his expression, cold, distant, calculating. It vanished quickly when his daughter tugged his hand, but it left me chilled. I forced a smile for Helen and the children, but my pulse hammered. That night, after everyone was asleep, I wandered into my old workshop. Dust covered the tools, but the bench was still solid. My hand brushed across the carved letters Andrew had etched there as a teenager, his initials, clumsy and proud. I traced them with my finger, the memories flooding back. Grief, love, guilt, they tangled inside me. Sitting there in the dim light, I admitted what I had been avoiding. Something was coming, something I couldn't yet name but felt in my bones. I whispered it aloud, barely hearing my own voice. There's something about to happen. The words hung in the air like a warning. For the first time in years, the comfort of routine no longer felt safe. The walls of our quiet life were shifting, and though I couldn't see the shape of the storm, I knew it was moving closer. It was late in the afternoon, the kind of hour when the light turns golden and the air cools just enough to remind me that autumn was close. I had been working on the back fence, hammering a loose board back into place, when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. I looked up and saw Jason walking toward me, alone. No Lauren, no children racing ahead of him, their voices bright. Just Jason, his shoulders hunched, his jaw set, his eyes holding a sharpness I hadn't seen before. "Hey, Dad," he said, voice flat. He didn't wait for me to answer before leaning against the fence post like a man who'd already made up his mind about something. I wiped the sweat from my brow and nodded, but the air between us was heavier than the late summer humidity. He didn't waste time on small talk. "I've been thinking about you and Mom. You're not getting younger. It's time to start planning for the future." His hand dipped into his leather satchel, pulling out a folder thick with papers. "I found a way to make things easier for all of us. You just need to sign these." I stared at the folder. Even from a few feet away, I recognized the type of documents they were. Power of attorney forms, authorization sheets, legal transfers. My pulse quickened. Jason's tone wasn't suggestive or tentative. It was firm, almost demanding, as though the matter had already been decided and I was simply a formality. I cleared my throat. "Jason, your mother and I can handle our affairs. We've managed for decades." His eyes narrowed. "Dad, this isn't about pride. It's about practicality. What happens if something happens to you? Or Mom? Don't you want someone you trust to take care of things?" The word trust echoed in my head like an accusation. I set the hammer down slowly. "We'll take care of it when the time comes. For now, we're fine." The change in him was immediate. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. He looked past me toward the house, his lips curling into something close to a sneer. Before I could respond, the screen door creaked open and Helen stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She smiled warmly, as she always did when she saw her son. "Jason, you didn't say you were coming by." "Are you staying for dinner?" Jason's expression shifted in an instant. The sharpness melted away, replaced by a smile so quick it felt rehearsed. "Just wanted to check in, Mom," he said lightly, tucking the folder back into his bag. "Can't stay long tonight." But I had seen it. That mask he wore, the thin veneer of affection, didn't fool me anymore. Helen looked between us, sensing the tension, but Jason reached over to kiss her cheek and promised to bring the kids by next weekend. He left almost as suddenly as he arrived, his boots striking the gravel with impatient force. When the sound of his truck faded down the road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As I turned back to the fence, something white caught my eye in the dirt. I bent down and picked up a single sheet of paper that must have slipped from his folder. My hand shook as I smoothed it out. It was a legal document, already filled with our names, our address, and most of the details typed neatly in black ink. Only the signature lines were blank, waiting for Helen's and mine. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket before Helen could see. She was watching me with concern. "What was that about?" she asked quietly. I forced a smile, kissed her forehead, and said, "Nothing you need to worry about right now." But my heart was pounding. Later that evening, after Helen had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I pulled out the paper and laid it flat on the table. My eyes lingered on the bold letters, durable power of attorney. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a plan. A plan my son had been building without me, maybe for months. Anger rose in me, but beneath it was something heavier. Grief. How had we come to this? How had my own flesh and blood begun to see me not as a father but as an obstacle? My mind drifted to Andrew, to the boy we lost all those years ago. If he were still alive, would Jason have turned out differently? Or had this darkness always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface? When Helen padded into the kitchen for a glass of water, she found me staring at the paper. She touched my shoulder, her eyes filled with worry. "Mike," she whispered, "what's happening to him?" I covered her hand with mine, my voice low. "I don't know, but I think we've crossed into something dangerous. He doesn't just need help, he wants control. And he's already drawing the lines to get it." The room felt colder as the truth settled between us. The faint laughter of our grandchildren from earlier in the evening seemed impossibly far away. I folded the document again, slipped it back into my pocket, and stared out into the dark yard where the fence loomed like a boundary between past and present. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my own son. I woke up the morning after Jason's visit with a heaviness in my chest. The paper he had left behind still lay folded in my jacket pocket, burning against me like a secret too dangerous to share. Helen had asked again what I planned to do, but I didn't have an answer that could ease her fear. Something in me still clung to the hope that this was all just a misunderstanding, that if I could talk to Jason father to son, I might find the boy I used to know hiding beneath the bitterness. So I called him and suggested we meet for coffee in town. Riverton only had 2 cafes worth mentioning, and I picked the one on Main Street, across from the old feed store. It was neutral ground, public enough to keep tempers in check. Jason showed up 10 minutes late, wearing a faded jacket and carrying that same leather satchel. He didn't order anything, just slid into the booth across from me with a guarded expression. I tried to start gently. "Jason, your mother and we've been worried about you. I know times are tough. Maybe we can help." His jaw tightened, but he let me speak. I told him I could reach out to some old friends at the mill, maybe line up work. I even said, against my better judgment, that we could lend him money to help with whatever debts were pressing. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need handouts, Dad. I don't need you calling in favors like I'm some charity case." His voice was low, but the words hit like stones. "What I need is a solution that actually makes sense. You and Mom are sitting on a house, land, retirement savings, and you barely use half of it. Meanwhile, I'm drowning, and you offer me scraps." The anger in his tone made my hands tremble under the table. "It's not scraps, son. It's help. That's what family does." He smirked, but there was no humor in it. Help would be making sure your assets are taken care of by someone who actually has a future. Help would be signing those papers. He tapped the satchel as if the forms were inside, waiting. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for control." The word chilled me. Control. It wasn't desperation speaking anymore. It was resolve. I shook my head. "Jason, your mother and I aren't ready to hand over our lives. You need to understand that." His eyes went cold. He slid out of the booth without another word, leaving me staring at the untouched coffee between us. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of the gulf that had opened between us, but the truth settled like a stone. I hadn't reached him. If anything, I'd pushed him further away. When I told Helen that evening, she listened silently, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "Mike," she whispered, "we need to talk to a lawyer. We can't ignore this anymore." I wanted to agree, but something in me resisted. Admitting we needed legal protection against our own son felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready for. "Let's give him time," I said, though my own words sounded hollow in the quiet kitchen. Helen's eyes filled with worry, and I hated myself for not being able to reassure her. Later, I went out to the old workshop behind the house, needing space to think. The air smelled of sawdust and rust, familiar and grounding. I reached for the padlock on the door and froze. The metal had fresh scratches, deep and jagged, like someone had tried to force it open. My stomach lurched. I pulled the door wide and stepped inside. Nothing seemed missing, but the cabinet where we kept our older financial records had been disturbed. A drawer half open, papers slightly askew. Whoever it was hadn't taken anything, or maybe they hadn't had time. But I knew who it had been. I stood in the dim light, the weight of my father's old hammer in my hand, feeling the betrayal sink deeper. Jason wasn't just circling us with words anymore. He was probing, testing, ready to break in if persuasion failed. The hope I had clung to, that a conversation, a gesture of help might bridge the distance, crumbled in that moment. My attempt at resolution had failed. Instead of easing the tension, it had sharpened it, drawn lines I couldn't ignore. I looked around the workshop at Andrew's initials carved into the bench, at the echoes of a son I had lost, and I felt the bitter ache of a truth I didn't want to face. The son I had left was becoming my enemy. I tightened my grip on the hammer, the silence pressing heavy around me. The path ahead was no longer about easing tension or finding compromise. It was about survival. And though I couldn't yet see how far Jason would go, I understood one thing with clarity: I couldn't escape. The storm had broken. Jason's invitation came on a Wednesday evening. He called, his voice unusually light, suggesting we take a family hike that weekend at Rockridge Canyon. "It'll be good for us," he said. "We haven't done something together in ages." His words were wrapped in warmth, but I felt the edges of something sharp underneath. Helen looked at me after I hung up, worry in her eyes. "Mike," she whispered, "I don't like this." I put a hand over hers and tried to sound steady. "If we say no, it only makes things worse. We'll go, and we'll keep our eyes open." Saturday morning was clear, the sky a flawless blue. Jason drove, insisting it would be easier than us taking our own car. He chatted as we wound along the narrow road through the pines, his voice filled with stories about the kids' school, about projects he was working on. But the more he talked, the more I felt the weight of the silence beneath his words. He spoke of keeping family strong, of planning for the future, phrases that might have sounded ordinary to anyone else but rang like warnings in my ears. Helen sat stiff beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Rockridge Canyon was beautiful, no denying that. The cliffs rose sharp and jagged, overlooking a valley where the river coiled silver under the sunlight. We hiked up the trail, Jason leading the way with an energy that seemed forced. My knees ached on the incline, but I kept pace, unwilling to show weakness. Helen stayed close, her hand brushing mine every so often like a silent reassurance. When we reached a flat outcropping, Jason stopped. The view was breathtaking, miles of forest stretching to the horizon. For a moment, I let myself believe maybe this was just a son trying to reconnect. Then Jason turned to us, and I saw the mask slip. "You know," he said, his smile fading, "life would be a hell of a lot simpler if certain things just ended naturally." His eyes locked on mine, unblinking. "Accidents happen up here all the time. Slips, falls, people don't come back." Helen's breath caught. My heart hammered in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, to stall, but Jason's expression hardened. The warmth was gone, replaced by cold resolve. He stepped closer, and before I could move, his hand shot forward. The shove was sudden, brutal, sending both Helen and me staggering toward the edge. The world tilted, the ground vanished beneath my feet, and I felt weightlessness grip me. For one impossible heartbeat, I thought this was the end. Helen's hand caught my arm as we tumbled, her grip fierce despite the momentum. Her face was close to mine, eyes wide with terror, but her lips moved. The words were faint, carried like a prayer into my ear, "Pretend we're dead." The command cut through the chaos, sharp as steel. Even as we fell, crashing through scrub and jagged stone, I clung to it. We hit the slope hard, pain bursting white-hot in my ribs, my shoulder, my legs. The world spun in a blur of dust and pine needles. When we finally stopped, tangled together against a cluster of rocks, the silence was deafening. My chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. Helen groaned softly, but her eyes told me she was alive. Above us, Jason stood on the cliff's edge, peering down. For a long, terrible moment, I thought he might climb down to finish the job, but instead he straightened, his silhouette sharp against the sky. From where I lay half hidden in shadow, I saw his face relax into grim certainty. He believed he had succeeded. I pressed Helen's hand, urging her to stay still, to keep silent. My body screamed with pain, but adrenaline kept me awake. I forced myself to breathe shallow, to look lifeless, every nerve focused on convincing Jason we were gone. He lingered a moment longer, scanning the slope, then turned and disappeared from sight. The quiet that followed was heavier than the fall. My mind reeled, trying to process what had just happened. My own son had pushed us, had looked at us not as parents, but as obstacles to be removed. And yet in the midst of that betrayal, Helen's whisper echoed like a lifeline. Pretend we're dead. She had given us a chance, however slim, to fight another day. I lay there, the taste of blood in my mouth, the weight of rock pressing against my side, and squeezed Helen's hand again. She blinked, tears streaking her dust-covered cheeks, but she nodded. We were broken, battered, but alive. Somewhere above, Jason walked away, certain he was free of us. But in the hollow silence of that canyon, I knew differently. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war I never imagined fighting, a war against the very blood of my blood. The world around me was a blur of jagged stone, icy wind, and the taste of blood in my mouth. Every inch of my body screamed with pain, yet I forced myself to stay aware. Beside me, Helen lay twisted against the rock, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes met mine, wide with fear but burning with determination. We had fallen, but by some cruel twist of fate, we were still alive. I tried to move, only to feel a white-hot pain shoot up my leg. My body wanted to convulse, to scream, but Helen's faint whisper anchored me. Michael, pretend we're dead. Her words were no louder than the wind slipping through the canyon walls, but they struck with the weight of a command. My first instinct was to reject it. My every nerve told me to cry for help, to announce to the world that we had survived, but then I remembered the look in Jason's eyes before the shove. The cold, calculated certainty. If he thought for a second we were still breathing, he'd come back to finish what he started. The decision settled heavy in my chest. I could not afford the luxury of instinct. Instead, I pressed my cheek against the unforgiving stone, slowing my breath until it was nearly invisible. The metallic tang of blood pooled on my tongue, but I refused to spit it out, afraid even that small sound would betray us. Helen reached for my hand, her fingers trembling, and together we chose silence over desperation. Minutes stretched into eternities. I could hear the sound of pebbles trickling down from above, and then footsteps. My heart pounded so loud I feared Jason would hear it echo off the canyon walls. A shadow shifted at the cliff's edge. He was back. Jason's voice carried down faintly, cold and mocking. Well, that's that. The scrape of stone against stone followed as he kicked loose a cluster of rocks. They rained down around us, sharp edges biting into my arms and shoulders. One heavy fragment smashed against my side, and I nearly gasped, but I clamped my jaw tight until my teeth ached. Helen's grip on my hand stiffened, her silent plea as clear as her earlier whisper. Stay still, stay dead. Jason lingered longer than I expected. His silhouette leaned over the edge, scanning, waiting. I forced myself not to blink, staring into the void as though life had already left me. Then, with a final grunt, he muttered something I couldn't make out and walked away. The crunch of his retreating boots against gravel faded, swallowed by the wind. When the sound was gone, Helen exhaled a shuddering breath, and I dared to draw air deeper into my lungs. The canyon seemed unbearably quiet, broken only by the rasp of our breathing and the distant rustle of pine trees high above. For the first time since the fall, I allowed myself to believe we might actually have a chance. As the hours dragged by, pain anchored me to the ground, yet my mind clung to survival. I thought of the years we had worked to build our lives, of the home filled with laughter that Jason had turned into a place of suspicion and betrayal. Rage simmered beneath my ribs, dulled only by the ache of my injuries. If we survived this, I swore silently, I would not rest until the truth about my son was brought into daylight. The sky dimmed into twilight, painting the cliff face in deep purples and shadows. Cold crept into my bones, and I shivered violently despite the warmth of Helen's hand in mine. She stirred, forcing a fragile smile onto her lips. "We're not gone yet," she whispered. Her courage gave me strength, though the reality of our injuries weighed heavy. Every movement was agony, and yet neither of us dared shift more than an inch. Somewhere in the distance, the faint thrum of an engine broke the silence. At first, I thought it was a trick of my mind, some desperate hallucination, but then Helen's eyes lit up. "Do you hear that?" The sound grew louder, the distinct chop of helicopter blades slicing through the evening air. Rescue. The word itself was dangerous to hope for, but my chest filled with a cautious fire nonetheless. We stayed still, terrified Jason might still be lurking nearby, but my heart dared to beat faster. If that helicopter circled near enough, perhaps someone would see us. Perhaps someone would bring us out of this nightmare alive. Helen squeezed my hand, her voice barely audible. We chose right. As the last traces of light slipped behind the mountains, I closed my eyes, summoning every ounce of willpower to endure until help arrived. My body was battered, my trust shattered, but my spirit remained unbroken. Jason thought he had silenced us, but he was wrong. If I lived to see another sunrise, I would make sure the world knew exactly what he had done. In that cold, silent gorge with the weight of stone pressing against my battered body, I made a vow. I would not die in silence. I would rise, and when I did, I would bring justice crashing down on the son who had betrayed us. The first thing I remember when I opened my eyes was the blinding white light above me and the faint beeping of a heart monitor. My body felt heavy, every limb wrapped in pain, but the fact that I could feel anything at all told me I was alive. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled my lungs, and for a moment I wondered if I had slipped into some dream, if the fall had taken me beyond this world. But then I turned my head, slowly, painfully, and saw Helen. She was lying in the bed next to mine, her head wrapped in bandages, one arm immobilized in a sling. Her chest rose and fell steadily, her face pale but peaceful in sleep. Relief swept through me so strongly I almost forgot the pain. We had survived. Against all odds, we were still here. A nurse appeared, checking the machines, smiling when she saw me conscious. She said we'd been lucky. 2 hikers had seen the dust from our fall and called for help. The story, at least the one everyone else believed, was simple. 2 aging hikers, careless on the cliffs, victims of gravity and misstep. She didn't question it. No one did. Later, a doctor explained our injuries: fractured ribs for me, a badly bruised leg, lacerations along my arms. Helen had a concussion and a broken collarbone. He shook his head with a kind of awe. Falls like that rarely end this way. You're both very fortunate. I wanted to laugh at the word fortunate. It felt wrong on my tongue, but I kept quiet, nodding, pretending to accept the narrative. Helen stirred at last, her eyes fluttering open, and when they met mine across the sterile gap between our beds, I saw her understanding. We couldn't speak the truth here. Not yet. When we were alone, she whispered, voice hoarse, "Don't tell them." Not until we know he's not watching. I squeezed her hand, agreeing. Every instinct in me wanted to scream Jason's name, to call him out, but Helen was right. He thought we were gone. As long as he believed it, we had the advantage. That night, a police officer came by. He was young, polite, asking routine questions. How did it happen? Did we lose footing? Were we hiking alone? I kept my answers measured, steady. We slipped, I said. The rocks were loose. My wife tried to grab me, and we both went down. He frowned slightly, glancing at his notepad. Maybe he'd noticed the strange pattern of our injuries. Maybe he'd seen the way my eyes darted to Helen's bed, but he didn't press. He closed his notebook with a nod. Rest up. You're lucky to be alive. Lucky. Again that word. I almost spat it back at him, but I forced myself to remain calm. If I broke, if I told the truth now, it could tip everything the wrong way. Jason could hear, Jason could act, and then the fragile miracle of our survival would be snuffed out. Alone in the silence of the ward, I let the guilt wash over me. I had raised that boy. I had once taught him how to swing a hammer, how to fish in the creek behind our house, how to drive on the empty dirt road. Somewhere along the line, I had failed. He had become a man capable of looking at his parents not as family but as obstacles. The betrayal cut deeper than any bruise or break in my body. Helen reached for my hand again before she drifted back into sleep. Her touch steadied me. She was right. We had to play dead for now, even here in this place of supposed safety. Our silence was the thin line between survival and destruction, but inside me something shifted. The man lying in that hospital bed was not the same man who had walked into Rock Ridge Canyon. I had been a father, forgiving and hopeful, blind to the shadows in my son's eyes. Now I was something else. I stared at the ceiling as machines hummed softly around me. If Jason believed we were gone, then I would use that lie to build my truth. I would recover, I would gather strength, and when the time was right, I would face him. Not as a broken man begging for mercy, but as a father who had survived his son's betrayal and was prepared to fight back. The night deepened, the hospital grew quiet, only the faint footsteps of nurses echoing down the hall. I turned my head once more toward Helen, her face softened by sleep, and I made a vow as binding as any oath I'd ever sworn. We had been pushed off a cliff, left for dead, but we were not gone. We were alive, and that meant Jason's day of reckoning was only beginning. Leaving the hospital felt nothing like a homecoming. The air outside was crisp, the sun low over the horizon, but as Helen and I rode back to Riverton in the neighbor's pickup, the town no longer looked the same. Every corner, every familiar storefront seemed touched by shadow. When we finally stepped into our small house, the silence pressed down on us. This had once been our refuge, filled with warmth and laughter. Now it felt like an open wound, haunted by Jason's betrayal. That first night home, sleep eluded me. I sat in the living room, staring at the clock as it ticked toward midnight, then 1, then 2. My ribs ached, my leg throbbed, but it was the torment in my mind that kept me awake. I kept replaying the look in Jason's eyes, the deliberate force of his hands on my back. How had I missed it? How had I not seen the man my son had become? Helen found me sitting there, the glow of a single lamp casting shadows across my face. She touched my shoulder gently. "Mike, this isn't your fault," she said. Her voice was tired but steady. "You raised him with love. What he's done, that's on him, not you." I wanted to believe her, but the guilt clung like tar. "I should have stopped him before it came to this," I murmured. She shook her head. "What matters now is that we stop him from doing more." Her words were sharp with conviction, and I felt a flicker of resolve catch inside me. The next morning, Helen suggested we reach out to Margaret Collins, an old friend who had been our family lawyer years ago. Margaret was shrewd, trustworthy, someone we could depend on. My first instinct was hesitation. If Jason learned we were alive, he would move quickly, perhaps even violently, to silence us. "If we go to her now," I said, "we're painting a target on our backs." But the decision was taken out of my hands later that day. While sorting through mail stacked on the kitchen counter, I found an envelope from the county clerk's office. Curious, I opened it and my stomach dropped. It was a notification of a pending land transfer, our names replaced with Jason's, accompanied by a copy of what was supposed to be our signatures. The sight made my blood run cold. The forgeries were clumsy but official enough to pass at a glance. Jason wasn't just planning, he was already acting, already reaching for what he thought was his. I slammed the papers onto the table, anger and fear colliding in my chest. "He's trying to steal everything," I said, my voice rough. Helen's face paled as she scanned the documents, then looked back at me with fire in her eyes. "We don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. We have to fight." That night, under the cover of darkness, we drove to a neighboring town where Margaret's office was. It felt safer to meet away from Riverton, away from the places Jason might expect us. Margaret greeted us with wide eyes and an embrace that held both shock and relief. "I thought you two were gone," she whispered. The news was already talking about a tragic accident. Over cups of coffee in her quiet office, we laid out everything. The shove at the canyon, the forged documents, Jason's cold words about life being easier without us. Margaret listened, her expression hardening with every detail. When we finished, she set her cup down with a decisive click. "What he's done is fraud, plain and simple." "And what happened on that cliff?" She paused, choosing her words. "That's attempted murder. But if we go to the police now, we need to be ready with evidence. We need to build this carefully, or he'll slip through the cracks." Her words steadied me. For the first time since the fall, I felt less like prey and more like someone preparing for a fight. Margaret promised to start pulling records, contacting trusted colleagues, and tracking Jason's financial moves. "He thinks you're gone," she said. "Let's use that. We'll gather what we need before he even realizes you're back." When we finally left her office, the night air was cold but strangely invigorating. Helen slipped her hand into mine, her grip strong despite the bandages. For the first time since we'd lain broken on the rocks of Rockridge Canyon, I felt a spark of hope. We were no longer just reacting, no longer trapped in fear. We had taken a step forward, small but real, onto the path of resistance. As we drove back, headlights cutting through the dark country road, I glanced at Helen. Her profile was calm, determined. "We'll stop him," I said, the words tasting like a vow. She turned to me and nodded. "Together, but..." And in that single word, I felt the weight of everything we had survived and the strength to face what lay ahead. Jason thought he had ended us, but he was wrong. We were alive, and now we had a plan. Weeks passed, each day marked by quiet strategy and hidden preparation. Helen and I moved carefully, guided by Margaret's steady hand. She knew which stones to overturn, which trails to follow, and soon enough we had a pile of evidence larger than I dared to imagine. Copies of falsified land deeds bearing our clumsy forged signatures, records from the county office, bank statements showing Jason funneling funds into accounts under his own name. Even more damning was the testimony of a bank clerk who had noticed the discrepancy in my supposed signature and quietly flagged it. Our home no longer felt like a place of rest, but like a command center. Papers littered the dining table, and Margaret's visits became routine. The tension was relentless, but beneath it all glimmered hope. For the first time, we weren't running or hiding. We were preparing to fight. Then came the morning when Margaret delivered the news. "The filings are in," she said, her voice firm. "Civil charges for fraud, and I've forwarded everything to the district attorney. The police will take it from here." Her words felt like a release, yet I knew it was only the beginning. 2 days later, Jason was summoned. Margaret told us he appeared shocked when the papers were handed over. He must have thought he was rid of us, that his careful plan had worked. To find out we were not only alive, but standing in opposition must have rattled him. That night, Helen and I lay awake, both of us listening for the crunch of tires in the gravel drive, for footsteps on the porch. We didn't have to wait long. The next evening, just as the sun bled orange into the horizon, Jason came. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and stormed into the living room, his face red, his movements frantic. "How could you?" he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "After everything I've done for this family, you betray me like this?" Helen flinched, but I rose slowly from my chair, forcing myself to meet his eyes. For years I had seen him as my boy, flawed but redeemable. Now I looked at him as he was, a grown man who had chosen greed and violence over blood and love. "You pushed us off a cliff," I said, my voice low but steady. "You forged our names. You tried to erase us. Don't talk to me about betrayal." Jason's hands curled into fists, his chest heaving. "I was protecting our legacy. You're old, weak. I was trying to make sure the family had a future." His words cracked under the weight of desperation, the justification of a man cornered. Helen's voice trembled as she spoke. "You nearly killed us, Jason. Your own parents. How can you even say this was for family?" For a moment, I thought he might strike us again, but then the wail of sirens cut through the air. Blue and red lights flashed through the window, painting the room in fractured colors. Jason's head snapped toward the sound, panic flickering across his face. The front door burst open and officers flooded in. "Jason Grayson, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted homicide." Their voices were sharp, practiced, leaving no room for argument. Jason tried to back away, tried to bolt, but they were on him before he could take 2 steps. He fought, cursing, thrashing as they forced his arms behind his back. His voice rose, wild with rage. "You did this!" he shouted at us. "You betrayed your own son!" His words cracked, and for an instant I saw a boy again, angry and lost. But the illusion shattered as he kicked and spat, the man he had become drowning out any trace of who he once was. Helen covered her face with her hands, tears spilling through her fingers. I wanted to reach for her, to comfort her, but my own heart was too heavy. Watching Jason dragged out in cuffs was a victory, yes, but it was also the most bitter sight I had ever known. The officers pulled him out to the waiting cruiser. He twisted once more to glare at us, his eyes burning with something between hatred and despair. Then the door slammed, the engine roared, and he was gone. Silence returned, broken only by Helen's sobs. I went to her, taking her hand in mine, steadying her trembling fingers. "It's over," I said, though I knew it wasn't, not really. This was only the first battle, the first step in a longer war. The law would handle him now, but the scar of his betrayal would remain. I looked out the window at the disappearing lights. My son was gone, taken by his own choices, his own crimes. And though we had survived, though we had won this round, the weight of what had been lost pressed down on me like stone. I held Helen close, her tears soaking into my shirt, and I told myself we had done what we had to do. We had chosen survival. We had chosen truth, and for that there could be no regret. The house regained its quiet the way a shoreline regains its tide, slowly with small retreats and returns that left a film of salt on everything. We moved through rooms that knew our laughter, our arguments, our birthdays, and ordinary Tuesdays, and we tried to relearn how to breathe there. The newspaper lay folded on the counter, the headlines still visible even when I turned it face down, a string of words colder than winter steel. Reporters called. Neighbors knocked with casseroles and cautious eyes. The phone rang and rang until I let it ring. What I wanted most was not congratulations or pity or rubbernecking curiosity. I wanted the simple authority of silence, owned, not enforced, chosen, not imposed. I wanted to stand in my kitchen, pour coffee into the mug I'd used for 20 years, and not feel like a witness in my own home. The morning light came in like it always had, turning the lace curtains a soft gold. I touched the window frame the way you touch a shoulder in the dark to make sure a loved one is still there. Outside, the maple at the edge of our yard had started to think about autumn. I caught the faintest curl of red at one leaf's edge, a small flare that said time was still moving, nature still noticed the calendar even if I had been living outside of it. The ordinary, I realized, is a kind of mercy. When it returns bruised, but still bearing gifts. The fridge hummed. The faucet squeaked. Somewhere down the road a dog barked like he had important business to settle with the squirrels. It would have been easy to call this peace. It wasn't peace, it was the scaffold you build, so peace might one day stand. On the table, the legal folder Margaret had given us sat like a book no one wants to open and no one can afford to ignore. Inside were copies of forms, timelines, affidavits, and 2 pages I had written by hand at her insistence. My account of the fall and everything before and after, dated, signed, and witnessed. She had said that paper is what memory becomes when memory needs allies. I had believed her in theory, now I believed her in my bones. I thought about all the ways danger wears a friendly face, a favor, an offer, a phrase that sounds like protection but tastes of control. If there was a ladder out of this, one rung would be testimony, and the next rung would be boundaries, and the rung after that would be the daily, unglamorous work of not forgetting what had been learned the hardest way possible. Across the room, a stack of condolence cards leaned against a flower vase. People meant well, but language has rituals that sometimes don't fit. I didn't need thoughts and prayers tied with ribbon. I needed the grammar of procedures, the syntax of consequences, the vocabulary of limits honored and enforced. I needed sleep that didn't rehearse harm and a morning that didn't audition dread. In the early hours, when memory has the stage to itself, I would feel again the air leaving my lungs, the sudden theft of gravity, the way the world became a slide of sky and rock and sound. Then the counterweight, one small sentence I now considered a sacrament, would arrive. Pretend we're dead. That whisper had been a raft. Now it had to be a bridge. Margaret called in the afternoon. Her voice carried calm the way good instruments carry pitch. Steady, assured, no vibrato of panic. She told us the next steps: hearings, motions, scheduling conferences, and the likely choreography of a defense determined to blur the clarity we had bled to earn. She explained how some attorneys prefer smoke to sunlight, how they would try to sell a narrative of desperation disguised as devotion, how they might produce a document that attempted to make me the architect of a financial ruin I had not built. I listened with a pencil in my hand, not to take notes so much as to have something to hold that wasn't a memory. When she paused, I heard myself ask, "What if people believe it?" The question surprised me. We had evidence, witnesses, statements. We had the simple geometry of a push and a cliff. And still, the worry found its way around facts like a river finds its way around rock. "They won't," she said, and then softened the promise. "And if some try to, we will give them reasons not to. Truth can be quiet, but it accumulates." I wrote that down even though I didn't need to. Accumulates. Like snow, like debt, like love, like courage. After we hung up, the afternoon drew out its long breath. I walked the perimeter of the yard the way a farmer walks his fences after a storm. It was an old habit that now felt ceremonial. I checked the latches on the gates, the hinges on the shed, the small pantry window we used to leave open in summer. The locks clicked, one by one. I had once considered locks unneighborly, a lack of trust made metal. Now I understood them differently. Locks are not accusations. They are boundaries in hardware form. A lock does not say you are bad. A lock says I am responsible. Back in the kitchen, I sat with a yellow ledger and drafted a different kind of inventory. Not of assets, those were already listed in clean columns, but of rules. Rule 1, never sign what you haven't read twice. Rule 2, never read alone what will shape a lifetime. Rule 3, refuse the urgency manufactured by someone else's timetable. Rule 4, if a request cannot survive a witness, it should not be granted in private. Rule 5, love is not a substitute for due process. I wrote them slowly, not because I needed the time to think, but because I wanted the time to remember. There is a speed to harm. There must be a slowness to safety. Evening arrived as a patient teacher. The light in the windows moved up the walls and then off them. The house settled into the creaks that once bothered me and now reassured me. Wood remembering it is wood. I brewed tea, the herbal kind that promises sleep without guaranteeing it. Steam rose like a benediction. I thought about what comes after justice, if justice comes the way we hope. People talk about closure the way they talk about sunsets, as if the day tucks itself in with one final photogenic flourish. But closure is not a door. It's a hinge. It lets you move without the ache of pushing a stuck frame. It does not make what happened unhappen. It makes going forward less noisy. We spoke little that night. Conversation has its seasons. Some days you harvest, some days you leave the field alone. I gathered the documents into their folder and slid them into the drawer where the good tablecloths used to live. We had stopped using that linen years ago after one Thanksgiving gravy disaster we still laughed about. Memory is practical like that. It makes room. It retires what's too fine for the work at hand and promotes what will not tear under strain. I wanted our home to feel like that. Less museum, more workshop. Less shrine to the past, more shelter for the future. Sleep came in parts. When it left, I let the dark be dark and did not argue with it. At some hour that belongs to owls and shift workers, I rose and wrote. Not because a court required it, not because a lawyer advised it, but because writing turned survival from an accident into a decision. I described the moment between falling and landing, how time stretched like wire, how a single choice found room in that impossible narrowness. I wrote about the methods that make justice possible, dates that anchor, signatures that match, witnesses who listen without improving the story. I wrote about the quiet heroism of clerks who notice what doesn't add up, of neighbors who carry soup and keep their opinions to themselves, of officers who do not confuse age with unreliability. And I wrote, finally, about the ordinary, the way a porch light can feel like a treaty with the night. Morning offered its modest gift, continuity. Coffee, toast, the newspaper moved to a chair where I wouldn't have to see it. On the calendar, a box around Thursday reminded me of the next meeting downtown. In the margin, I had written a sentence that had become a compass line: speak plainly. Plain speech is not cruel. It is care that refuses to be misunderstood. I practiced in my head the answers to questions I knew would come. Did you slip? Number. Were you alone? Number. Did you fear for your life? Yes. How do you know what you know? Because memory and evidence shake hands on this. A letter arrived with no return address, the handwriting careful, the lines straight. Inside was a single page from someone who had watched from a distance and recognized something of their own history and ours. It contained one sentence that I have folded and refolded until the paper grew soft. You taught me that survival can be quiet, but dignity must be spoken. I placed it with the legal documents, not because it would be entered into any record, but because it belonged among the tools we were using to build the next part of our life. As the week turned, the idea of testimony stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like an inheritance. We had lived long enough to know the difference between humiliation and humility. The first is forced upon you, the second you choose so truth can stand taller than pride. If we were to stand in a room and tell what happened, I wanted our words to carry both. Humility for the frailty we all carry and the refusal to be humiliated by the choices of another. There is a maturity that arrives only when you are done asking why me and start asking what now. The what now was the list on our refrigerator. Photocopies to make, a safe deposit box to rent, a second set of keys for a trusted friend. A password manager finally learned after years of promising to get around to it. Not dramatic things, not movie things. The infrastructure of safety, the scaffolding of a quieter life sturdy enough to withstand the echo of older storms. Sometimes the most radical act is to label a file and put it where it belongs. In the afternoons, I walk the river trail at a patient pace. The water keeps its own counsel. It remembers what it chooses to remember. I watched the current take a branch and then a leaf and then nothing. And I thought about how letting go is not a single act. It's a habit you learn, 1,000 micro-decisions, to stop rehearsing what harmed you and start rehearsing what holds you. The trail passed a bench someone had dedicated to a life I didn't know. The plaque was simple, a name, 2 dates, and a line that read, "He kept his word." I stood there longer than I meant to, as if I had stumbled upon a thesis statement for the kind of old age I wanted, one where promises are small enough to keep and important enough to matter. In the quiet that followed, I practiced the hardest discipline, refusing to let harm define the horizon. I would feel the outline of fear rise like a mirage and then step through it. I would let the phone ring once and then answer it as the adult I still was. I would fold laundry and consider it a form of prayer, the restoration of order at the level of shirts and towels, proof that usefulness doesn't retire when chaos arrives. I would sit beside the person who shared my table and, in our shared silence, feel a town rise in the distance where language would live again, stronger, less eager to please, more eager to be true. Margaret's next call came with dates and times and the practicalities that make nerves honest. She reminded us that the road from here would not be clean. It never is. There would be depositions where patience is bait. There would be motions written to sound like rescue and built like traps. There would be days when exhaustion would masquerade as agreement. On those days, she said, let your future self veto what your tired self wants to concede. I wrote that on a sticky note and placed it on the inside of the folder, a lighthouse in miniature. The night before the hearing, I ironed a shirt I hadn't worn since a wedding. The act felt ceremonial, a way to tell my hands we were preparing for something solemn. I checked the folder twice, then again, and laid it by the door. On the table, I left a page from my notebook. It was not a letter, not exactly a prayer. It was a promise, 12 words long, that I could carry into any room without my voice shaking. We are alive, and we will be heard, and we will be clear. Sleep came easier than I expected, perhaps because the unknown had finally acquired a schedule. Dawn met me halfway down the hall, and together we reached the kitchen where light did what it always does, made the ordinary visible again. I poured coffee. I opened the curtain. I let the day be a day, not a metaphor. In the mirror by the door, a face I knew looked back at me, not younger or older than yesterday, just more decided. It is strange what crisis edits and what it leaves intact. It had cut out the need to be liked. It had kept the need to be truthful. The drive downtown was quiet. The courthouse waited, with its stone steps and tired flags, an architecture of procedure. We walked past people whose stories would never reach a newspaper and people whose stories had been swallowed by them. Security wands beeped, belts came off, handbags opened to reveal breath mints and pins and the private cargo of ordinary lives. In the hallway outside the hearing room, I noticed a bulletin board covered with community notices, blood drives, language classes, tenant rights clinics. Small institutions doing the slow work that keeps big institutions honest. It comforted me more than I expected. The hearing itself was brief, just the beginning of beginnings. Papers were acknowledged, schedules set, and the room emptied with the efficient shuffle of a system that sees 1,000 beginnings every year. Outside on the steps, the air tasted like the beginning of rain. Reporters stood in small clusters, weighing which faces to chase. None came our way, which felt like grace. We descended carefully, not because the steps were steep, but because we had made a promise to ourselves. Nothing rushed, nothing hidden, nothing granted without the process its dignity. Back home, I placed the folder on the shelf we had cleared for it and closed the door. Not to forget it, not to pretend it was over, but to honor that life is not only this. There are still meals to cook and a garden to unweary. There are friends to answer and appointments to keep and books to finish that were left face down months ago. There are jokes still funny after the 100th telling and stories that have earned their right to be retold with a new endings. That evening, I returned to the notebook and wrote the line that would be my last word to the day, my opening to whatever came next. Our own son pushed us off a cliff to silence us. A whisper turned survival into strategy. Now clarity will turn survival into witness. I read it aloud once, not to the room, not to the past, but to the future I intended to live in. The words did not tremble. They didn't need to be louder. They needed only to be exact. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch and let the darkness settle around me without asking what it held. Somewhere nearby, the river kept its promises to distance and time. A nightbird tried a song and gave up. I stood there a long minute and felt, for the first time since the fall, something like gratitude that did not argue with grief. The world, after all, had not narrowed to a single story. It had widened around one. And in that wider world, I would move at the speed of truth, carrying what must be carried and setting down what could finally be put away. Sometimes the first truth worth admitting is that love alone is not a safety net. It can be a compass, a shelter, a prayer in the dark, but it is not armor against the harm that grows in silence. There are moments when trust breaks not with a sound but with a breath, a hand that withdraws, a question asked with the wrong intention, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. In those moments, people learn what endurance really means. Not the kind on medals or in stadiums, but the quieter kind, the kind that keeps a heart beating through shock, keeps a mind clear enough to choose survival over panic, keeps a soul steady long enough to tell the truth when the truth is all that's left. This story was never simply about a fall. It was about the weight of what pushed before the fall. Years of unspoken resentments, hidden ledgers, and the slow erosion of boundaries that should have been sacred. It was about what happens when age is treated like a ticking clock rather than a library full of lived wisdom, when tenderness is mistaken for weakness, and when a family forgets that loyalty is not a deed to be signed, but a daily practice to be honored. The chasm that opened was not carved by rock, it was carved by choices. And yet even in that unthinkable split second between balance and oblivion, the human will found a way to hold on. In a single whisper, a strategy was born. Survive now, speak later. It is not cowardice to be quiet when quiet is the only bridge to the next breath. Sometimes the bravest act is to conserve your voice until there is air enough to use it. The lesson lives there, in the discipline to protect life first and in the promise that survival is not the end of the story. Survival is the start of the testimony. It is the first word of a longer sentence that includes accountability, boundaries, and repair, if repair is possible, or release when it is not. Justice in the real world rarely arrives like thunder. It shows up in paperwork and protocols, in phone calls and sworn statements, in the patient gathering of small facts that together become undeniable. Justice is a craft. It asks for resilience, for community, for professionals who take their oaths seriously, for friends who believe the inconvenient version of events and stand by it. It asks for the wisdom to know when to be silent and when to speak, when to wait and when to act. And it demands that those who have been hurt do the hardest thing of all, to see clearly the shape of what happened without letting it become the shape of who they are. Age, for its part, is not an exit sign. It is an archive of patterns. It is the long rehearsal that allows a person to spot the difference between a helping hand and a hand that guides toward a ledge. It is the earned right to say no, to ask for counsel, to require process, to require witnesses. It is the accumulated strength to insist on transparency when others push for haste. Refusing to be rushed is not stubbornness, it is stewardship. Saying, "Let me think. Let me read. Let me call someone I trust," is not an insult to love. It is a safeguard for love. There is a kind of courage that looks like tenderness. It's the courage to set limits that protect what matters. It's the courage to place financial boundaries where affection once stood alone. It's the courage to move documents into the light, wills, deeds, powers of attorney, so they can be as honest as intentions claim to be. Transparency does not wound good faith. It purifies it. If a request cannot survive the light of shared understanding, it should not be granted in the dark. Families don't break because questions are asked. They break because questions are forbidden. Forgiveness, too, must be revised in stories like this. It is not the erasing of memory, nor the softening of consequences. Forgiveness is the refusal to carry rage like a second heartbeat. It is the choice to let accountability do its work while allowing one's own spirit to travel lighter. Forgiveness is not a shortcut around truth. It is a path that begins after truth has been told, documented, and given room to matter. Some doors, once closed for safety, should remain closed. That isn't bitterness. That is wisdom that keeps future harm from finding the same way in. To those who have been dismissed because they are older or quiet or kind, do not confuse gentleness with passivity. Gentleness is controlled strength. It is the decision to use power without violence, insight without cruelty, history without weaponizing it. Your steadiness is not a liability. It's the anchor that keeps a whole world from drifting when storms arrive. When people tell you to hurry, consider what they gain from your speed. When they tell you to trust, ask what they offer to make that trust verifiable. Love can be blind. Stewardship must see. Let this be a practical lesson as much as a moral one. Keep duplicates of crucial records. Place copies where pressure cannot reach them. Invite a neutral professional into conversations that carry lifelong consequences. Tell someone beyond the family what you fear and why. Create conditions in which truth does not depend on a single voice being heard on a single day. When safety requires silence, prepare the proof that will speak later. If you must play dead to live, do it only long enough to rise and speak with precision. And when the time comes to speak, speak clearly. A testimony is not vengeance, it is alignment. The facts arranged so that reality can be recognized and responded to. A testimony respects the dignity of everyone involved, even as it refuses to shrink the harm that has been done. It makes room for the complexity of motives without letting complexity become an alibi. It points forward, beyond punishment alone, to the restoration of boundaries, the repair of institutions, and the sustainable safety of the vulnerable. After shock, there is often quiet. In that quiet, meaning is made. What began as a drop into darkness becomes a climb toward light, slow, imperfect, but real. There are hands along the way, officers who listen, clerks who notice what doesn't add up, neighbors who show up with soup and silence that doesn't demand a performance. There are moments in the mirror when the face looking back is new, not because the lines have deepened, though they have, but because attention has sharpened. The person who returns to ordinary life after extraordinary harm is not naive anymore. They are precise. They know what to sign and what not to sign. They know how to ask for a witness. They know the cost of peace and the price of pretending. If there is a single thread running through this whole journey, it is this. Survival is not only staying alive, it is staying whole. Wholeness is the careful knitting together of body, memory, boundaries, and purpose. Some days it looks like paperwork. Some days it looks like saying no. Some days it looks like letting the porch light burn while you sit beside someone you love, breathing in sync, learning again how to be unafraid. Every step forward is an answer to what tried to silence you. One day the world will stop asking for the details. The headlines will fade. The friends who stood close will return to their routines. In that spaciousness, dignity grows. You wake, make a coffee, water the plants, open the curtains, and notice that the air no longer tastes like memory. There is still grief, but it is not steering anymore. There is still anger, but it no longer writes your lines. You live not as a reaction to harm, but as a witness that harm didn't get the final word. So carry this with you. Love is not what allows you to ignore red flags. Love is what empowers you to honor them. Trust is not blind faith. Trust is informed consent. Safety is not silence. Safety is the right timing of your voice. And justice is not a single verdict. It is the everyday work of keeping doors locked that must stay locked and paths open that deserve to stay open. Choose counselors. Choose documentation. Choose the slower process that prevents the faster tragedy. Choose yourself and those who choose you back. If you're listening from a place of fresh hurt, may this be your reminder. Your pulse is proof that the story is not over. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to strategize. You are allowed to be ordinary again. Nothing stolen from you, time, money, safety, confidence, will define your future unless you hand it the pen. You went quiet to survive. Now you may speak to live. Thank you for sharing this time with us today. Your presence turns a story into a circle of witness, and circles are stronger than cliffs. If this resonated, we'd love to hear how. What line stayed with you? What moment made you breathe deeper? What question you're still carrying? Before you go, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you feel comfortable, share the timestamp of a moment that hit home. Your reflections help others find their own footing. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you'd like more true stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet courage of ordinary lives. Until next time, take care of your voice, your boundaries, and your people. And remember, the ground beneath you is steadier than the fear above.